Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Ayman Nazir and welcome back to Knowledge Realm. Students, today we're going to continue pre-partition history of Pakistan and we're going to start from where we stopped in the last lecture. Today we're going to study two major topics, that is Simla Deputation and Minto-Morley Reforms. The source of the lecture, the material that I'm going to teach here today, once again, this is Trek to Pakistan by Ahmed Said. So let's get started. So here is the list of the contents. Here is what we're going to study today. We're going to study Simla Deputation of 1906, then formation of All India Muslim League in 1906, then Minto-Morley Reforms of 1909, and then we're going to study how All India Muslim League changed the path of its politics. When it was formed in 1906, the founder of the party had some different objectives, but then after 1909 the path of the politics was changed of All India Muslim League. So we're going to study all this today. So students, let's start with Simla Deputation. What was this event of pre-partition history of Pakistan? What happened at the time in India that made Muslim leaders realize that now they should present some demands in front of the Viceroy of India and the Secretary of State also. So we're going to start with the background of Simla Deputation. Students, we have studied already that in 1892 British Parliament gave Indian Council Act, and in that act British Parliament increased the number of additional members in Imperial Legislative Council of India. The number was increased from 6 to 12 to 10 to 16. It was decided that now the additional members in Imperial Legislative Council would not be less than 10 and would not be more than 16. The additional members were the locals of India. They were not English, but they were the people of India. They were locals. So this was decided in 1892, Indian Council Act of 1892. But Indians were not satisfied with the Indian Council Act of 1892. They wanted more powers in Legislative Council. In fact, Indian National Congress demanded electoral system. It demanded democracy and direct election system in India. Hindus were infuriated due to partition of Bengal of 1905. This is a topic that we studied in the previous lecture in detail. In 1905, under Lord Curzon, Bengal was partitioned in East Bengal and West Bengal, and Hindus were not happy with this partition. They accused Britishers that Britishers are dividing Hindus and Muslims. So they were not happy with this partition of Bengal, and they kicked up a severe storm of protest in Bengal and in entire India. Then, to pacify Hindus and to pacify Indians, British Parliament decided to increase the number of seats for the legislative councils and their powers also. Britishers announced that they're gonna present some reforms in India, and it was announced by Secretary of State John Morley on July 20, 1906. John Morley announced this in British Parliament, and he gave this news that they're going to do some reforms in India. The people of India, the Hindus and the Muslims envisaged electoral system in the reforms that were upcoming, that were expected in India. They thought that now Britishers are gonna introduce electoral system in India. So this announcement aroused fear in Muslims of India. Muslims were afraid that now direct democracy would be introduced in India. That was not in favor of Muslims, because Muslims were a vulnerable minority in India. So what were the fears of Muslims, and why Muslims were not happy with the democracy? Well, We all know that India was inhabited by a heterogeneous mass of different races and creeds, and these different races were often at variance. Their interests were often at variance. There were Hindus, there were Muslims, there were Sikh, there were Buddhists, and there were many races in India. Majorly, there were Hindus and Muslims. The majority was of Hindus, and Muslims were a vulnerable minority. So John Morley's speech aroused fear and anxiety in Muslim leaders. Muslim leaders now feared direct election system in India, but they didn't want any election system in India because they knew that it is not in favor of Muslims. Neither direct elections nor nominations were suited to the requirement of Muslims of India. Muslims were a vulnerable minority. I've added a very interesting quote of K.K. Aziz from the book of The Making of Pakistan. He says that pure democracy postulated that minorities bow to the will of the majority. Now, who is majority here? Who was majority in India? It were the Hindus. And who is minority? Minority was Muslims. Muslims were minority and Hindus were majority. So Muslim leaders knew that if the democracy was implemented, was started in India, Muslims who were the minority would have to bow their will to the majority, that is Hindus. Muslims would be crushed then. Muslim leaders knew all this. They envisaged all this. They knew that this is going to happen if democracy was implemented in India. So they started fearing direct election system in India. And the reaction of Hindus on partition of Bengal also proved it that Muslims are a vulnerable minority and they cannot live in a state where Hindus rule with the majority. So these were the fears of Muslims. Muslims feared direct election system in India. So this was the background of Simla Deputation, why Simla Deputation was led by Muslims and what led to this deputation. Now here is a very interesting slide that I have designed to explain the threat that was felt by Muslim leaders of India in 1906. Muslim leaders feared democracy system in India and they did not want direct democracy in India because they knew that direct democracy would never be in favor of Muslims and it would be of no benefit for Muslims. So what was the issue with direct democracy system? Why Muslims did not want direct democracy system in India? I'm going to explain it here and I'm going to try to make it very simple for all the listeners. The issue of majority-based democracy system. So just try to understand and focus. I'm going to try my best. Let's imagine that there is a constituency with population of 1,000 people. And out of these 1,000 people, 800 are Hindus and only 200 are Muslims. Because we know that India was majorly Hindu and Muslims were only a minority. So let's imagine that 800 of this constituency of 1,000 people were Hindus and 200 were Muslims. And then elections were introduced, elections were announced, and there was a joint electorate system. Just imagine this, that there was a joint electorate system. A joint electorate system is a system in which anyone, irrespective of their religion, anyone could stand in election, anyone could represent Hindus and Muslims, and anyone could stand and could fight in election. So there's a person, Ali, who is definitely Muslim, who stood in election, and there is another person, another candidate, who is named Manoj, who is definitely Hindu, who stood in election from this joint electorate. So what do you guys think? What would be the result of this election from joint electorate system? Who's gonna win this election? Well, a realistic approach suggests that definitely, undoubtedly, Manoj, who is a Hindu, will win this election. Because 800 people of this constituency are Hindus, and Hindus are definitely not going to vote a Muslim. They would vote Manoj, and they would try to make Manoj win this election. So securing 800 votes, Manoj will definitely win the seat. This was the joint electorate system. And we all know that a Hindu can never represent Muslims. A Hindu can never represent the interest of Muslims. We all know this. This is a very realistic and practical approach. There is no need to feel any hatred or any hostility against Hindus. This was a very realistic approach of Muslim leaders of that time. They knew that Hindus can never represent the interest of Muslims, just like Muslims can never represent the interest of Hindus. These two nations are different. These two nations are separate. So this was the threat of joint electorate system that was felt by the Muslims of that time. I do not intend to instigate any hatred among Muslims and Hindus. I'm just trying to explain that Muslim leaders were very practical at that time. They knew that Hindus cannot represent Muslims, so they wanted to secure the rights and interests of Muslims. This is the reason that they demanded a separate electorate system. Because they did not want to risk the rights and the interest of Muslims, they demanded a separate electorate system. This is the soul of Simla Deputation that I'm explaining here, so just try to understand it. Now, what is a separate electorate system? A separate electorate system means that separate electorate for Hindus and separate electorate for Muslims. There is an electorate that is assigned to Muslims. Now what would happen? No Hindu could ever stand in election from that electorate. That electorate is for Muslims, and only Muslim can stand in election from that particular electorate. Now once again, just imagine this situation. There is a constituency with population of 200 Muslims, and suddenly elections are announced in the country. Now only Muslims have the right to stand in election from this particular electorate. Now a person named Ali is a candidate in election, and another person named Ahsan is the candidate in election. So no matter who wins this election, the seat will be of a Muslim in either case. Both of the candidates are Muslim. Ali is Muslim, Ahsan is also Muslim. So the seat will be of a Muslim, and a Muslim would be representing the population of 200 Muslims, and a Muslim would be able to represent Muslim in parliament and to protect the rights of Muslim, the interest of Muslim in parliament. This was the benefit, this was the advantage of separate electorate system for Muslims of India, and this is what Muslim leaders wanted in India. This was the demand of Muslim leaders in India. Just make it clear that Muslim leaders did not intend to create a rift between Hindus and Muslims, to instigate hostilities between Hindus and Muslims. No, this was not at all their intention. They were just being realistic. They were just being practical. They just wanted to protect the rights of Muslim minority. They just wanted to protect the interest of Muslim minority. And this was in the interest of both Hindus and Muslims also, the separate electorate system. So this was the soul of Simla Deputation. I've tried to make it clear here. I've tried to make it simple here, and I hope that all the listeners now understand what was the issue of majority-based democracy system and why this Simla Deputation was led by Muslims. What was the main aim of this deputation? So now let's continue and see what do we have more on this topic. So I have explained in detail the issue of majority-based democracy system. I have explained that what aroused fear in the hearts of Muslim leaders in India, and I hope that it is very much clear now. So now let's just continue with the story of Simla Deputation. What happened after John Morley announced that they are planning to introduce reforms in India? What happened after that? After that, Muslim leaders felt anxious. They were afraid of a democracy system in India, and they started discussing that what they should do now. Then Mohsin Mulk, who was the secretary of the MAO college, he wrote to William Archbold, who was the principal of the college. William Archbold gave hope to Muslim leaders, and he wrote to Dunlop Smith, who was private secretary to the Viceroy of India. Lord Minto was Viceroy of India at the time, and Dunlop Smith arranged the meeting with Viceroy of India. A meeting was arranged, a meeting of Muslim leaders and Viceroy of India, who was Lord Minto at the time. Then a deputation of 35 people went to present some demands before John Morley, who was Secretary of State, and Lord Minto, who was Viceroy of State. And the deputation went on October 1st, 1906. This deputation was led by Sir Aga Khan. Keep such kind of information in mind. This would be helpful in objective. And this was the first time when Hindu-Muslim conflict was raised to constitutional plane. It was Simla Deputation when Hindu-Muslim conflict was raised to constitutional plane. It was presented before the government of that time. Now, what were the demands of Muslims? What demands were presented by this deputation of 35 people in front of Lord Minto and John Morley? I have enlisted these demands here. Muslims demanded separate electorates for Muslims because they wanted to protect the rights of Muslims. Moreover, Muslims demanded that Muslims should be given the representation on the Imperial Legislative Council. There should be direct elections instead of nominations. Muslims should be given their due share in the Gazette and non-Gazette cadre according to a specific proportion. Muslims should be appointed as the judges of high courts as well as the chief courts. Seats should be reserved for the Muslims on the senates and syndicates of the various universities. There should be financial help for Muslim universities, and Muslims should be given representation on the Executive Council of the Governor General. These were the demands presented by Simla Deputation. Then Lord Minto satisfied them, and Muslims secured their right of separate electorate. This was a victory for Muslims of India. And Muslims celebrated it, but let's see how other nations, majorly Hindus, reacted to this Simla Deputation. Now, what were the impacts of Simla Deputation? Well, Hindus reacted negatively. They called it a conspiracy of government to stop the nationalist activities in India. They said that the British government is trying to create a rift between Hindu and Muslims to stop the nationalist activities. Hindu newspaper also maligned this deputation, and William Archbold, who was the principal of MAO College, who helped Muslims meet the Viceroy and Secretary of State, was also accused of being part of this conspiracy. Hindus were not happy with this deputation, and they reacted negatively. Well, this was the natural reaction of Hindus. I mean, they did not want a rift between Muslims and and Hindus, they did not want separate electorate for Muslims, so this was a natural reaction from Hindus. But there were benefits for Muslims. Muslims were benefited from this deputation. The demands of Muslims were accepted by Lord Minto, and Muslims secured separate electorate after this deputation, and the issue of Hindu-Muslim was raised to constitutional plane for the first time. This was beneficial for Muslims, and it was the foundation of all future constitutional efforts and proposals by Muslims. Sir Aga Khan said that its final and inevitable consequence was the partition of India and the emergence of Pakistan. Moreover, the die-hard Congressite Maulvi Tufail Ahmed said the Muslims at large were very happy at the success of the deputation, and this is the truth. Muslims were happy with the success of the deputation because they knew that now there would be separate electorates for Muslims, and Muslims would be able to be a part of the parliament and to protect their interests and rights in the parliament. Muslims would be able to represent themselves in the parliament. So they were happy at the success of the deputation. Well, students, Simla Deputation was actually the very first step in making people realize, in making Hindus, Muslims, and government realize that Muslims and Hindus are two separate nations. It was the first practical step that implemented two-nation theory. And try to understand this because Simla Deputation demanded separate electorate for Muslims. That explains that gives an idea that Muslims are separate. They are separate nation, so they should be given separate electorate. So this was the first step that implemented this theory, the two-nation theory. So Simla Deputation has a lot of significance in this Pakistan movement. This is very much important, and it was a landmark in the political movement of Muslims of India. So we have studied a lot about Simla Deputation. Now let's see what do we have more. Alright, so now we're going to study formation of All India Muslim League, the party that represented Muslims in India and the party that started Pakistan movement, and that was the reason behind the independence and formation of Pakistan. So it was formed in 1906, and it was formed after the annual session of All India Mohammedan Educational Conference in December 1906. It was formed by the leaders of All India Mohammedan Educational Conference, Nawab Vikarul Mulk, Nawab Salimullah, Maulana Zafar Ali Khan, Hakim Ajmal Khan. These were the people who were in that conference in 1906, December of 1906. And the meeting was presided by Nawab Vikarul Mulk at his house on December 30, 1906. It came into being. But what were the events that led to the formation of All India Muslim League? What were the events that made these leaders realize that now Muslims should have a party, a political party of their own? A political party should represent Muslims in India. Well, there were many events. First of all, there were anti-Muslim movements in India that made Muslim leaders realize that they should make a Muslim political party to protect Muslims of India. Then partition of Bengal kicked up severe protest by Hindus. Hindus just started protest after the partition of Bengal. They could not digest this partition and they were not happy with this partition. So another event that led to the formation of All India Muslim League was Hindi and Urdu controversy of 1867. It also awakened the Muslims, and especially Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. It awakened Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. Before 1867, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was advocate of Hindu-Muslim unity. But after this Hindi and Urdu controversy, Sir Syed realized that Muslims and Hindus can never live in a single state, and they are two separate nations. They can never be united in a single state. So Hindi-Urdu controversy also awakened the Muslim leaders. Then Hindus maligned Simla Deputation. Hindus deplored that Muslims have their own separate electorate now. They did not like this fact. So this was another event in the history of India that made Muslim leaders realize the need of a separate political party for Muslims. Then Muslims realized that Indian National Congress would never represent Muslims. It would never protect the rights of Muslims. So they understood, they realized that Muslims are insecure in India. Then Muslims felt the need to make a political platform for themselves, and they formed the political platform that was called All India Muslim League. And another event that was the speech of John Morley in 1906 in British Parliament, that gave an idea of direct election system, of the introduction of direct election system in India. And there were expectations of a direct election system in India. It aroused anxiety and fear in Muslim leaders, and Muslim leaders feared that in democracy, in direct election system of India, Muslims would be crushed, Muslims would be subjugated, and Hindus would never represent Muslims. So they started feeling the need of introduction of a separate political platform for Muslims. So they formed All India Muslim League in 1906. That eventually led to the formation and independence of Pakistan. So what were the aims and objectives of All India Muslim League? Let's study. Well, majorly there were three aims. First of all, it was to promote feeling of loyalty to the British government, to promote and advance the political rights of Muslims of India, and to prevent the rise of hostilities in Muslims against any community of India. So this was a brief account of the formation of All India Muslim League, how All India Muslim League came into being, and what were the reasons, what were the events that led to the formation of All India Muslim League, and what were the aims and objectives of All India Muslim League. So this is enough for All India Muslim League. Now the most important topic of this lecture that we're going to study today, the most important and interesting also, Minto-Morley Reforms of 1909. So we're going to start with the background of Minto-Morley Reforms. Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India and John Morley was the Secretary of State of India. So these reforms were called Minto-Morley Reforms after the name of the Viceroy and Secretary of State of India. But we can also call this the Indian Council Act of 1909. It was similar. It was just another act, Indian Council Act, just like the Indian Council Act of 1861, 1892. This was also the Indian Council Act of 1892, but people called it Minto-Morley Reforms after the name of the Viceroy and Secretary of State of India. So what led to these reforms of 1909, and why British introduced these reforms? Well, we have studied in the background of Simla Deputation that Indians were not satisfied with the Indian Council Act of 1892. They wanted more powers in Legislative Council. They wanted more authority in the governing process of India. And the partition of Bengal also agitated Hindus of India. So to pacify Indians and to calm down Indians, these reforms were introduced. These reforms were aimed at giving representation to the maximum number of sections of society to win their support for government. This was the main aim behind these reforms, behind these Minto-Morley reforms. Lord Minto and John Morley wanted to gain the support of society. They wanted to gain the support of all sections of society, be it Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs, everyone. They wanted to gain the support of all sections of society to pacify them, to calm them down, to prevent any protest or any agitational politics. Then All India Muslim League also made the Muslims conscious of the need to protect and preserve their rights. Then Simla Deputation of 1906 also pushed British to introduce these reforms. Well, there was also a role of Lord Minto in these reforms. Lord Minto, who was the Viceroy of India at the time, was actually desirous to win the support of Indians. He wanted to pacify Indians, he wanted to suppress and he wanted to neutralize all the protest and all the agitation in India. He did not want any protest, he did not want any hatred or any agitation in Indians, because he wanted to protect British Raj in India. This was his main aim, that he wanted to strengthen and he wanted to protect British Raj in India. So he just wanted to calm down Indians, he just wanted to win the supports of Indians through these reforms. And he believed that representative system of Western sense was inapplicable in India. Democracy was inapplicable in India owing to some of the incapacities of India, owing to the low literacy rate of India and the lack of experience of people of India in politics. So he believed that representative system of Western sense was not applicable in India. He believed that the welfare of India lay in the continuation of the British Raj. British actually wanted a constitutional autocracy that is a blend of absolutism and constitutionalism. So this is the reason that Lord Minto introduced Minto-Morley reforms in India, because he wanted to pacify Indians to strengthen British Raj. This was the main aim behind these reforms. So in 1909, Minto-Morley reforms were introduced in India. Main features of these reforms are enlisted here. First of all, additional members of Governor General Executive Council were increased to 60. It was like a small assembly, and Muslims were given the right of separate electorate. This was a victory for Muslims. This was a political victory for Muslims of India. Then powers of the members of Imperial Legislative Council was increased. They could discuss the budget and move resolutions regarding tax amendments, and members of the Imperial Legislative Council could also ask the questions and supplementary questions. Members of Imperial Legislative Council were also allowed to move resolutions. The number of the members of Executive Council of Governor of Bombay, Madras and Bengal were also increased to 4. The number of additional members in various provinces were also increased, and for the first time an Indian was appointed in the Executive Council of Viceroy. It was S.B. Sinha, who was a Hindu, and the Muslim was Sayyid Ali Imam. Keep it in mind, it would help in objective portion of the exam. So these were some of the main features of Minto-Morley reforms, and studying these reforms, these features of reforms, you can make an idea that this was an attempt to pacify all the agitation of Indians. This was to calm down Indians. Now we're going to study how Minto-Morley reforms impacted India. What was the reaction of Indians? What was the reaction of Muslims? So the reforms were actually welcomed in the moderate circles of India. Some Congress people who were moderate welcomed these reforms. They were happy with these reforms, but the extremist people were not satisfied with the reforms. They wanted direct election, they wanted democracy in India. That was not possible at the time. Then All India Muslim League also welcomed the reforms. They were happy. They gained separate electorate systems, so they were happy with this. And the All India Muslim League also passed a resolution in 1910 which offered cooperation with the government. Now let's see what was the positive aspects of the reforms and negative also. So the positive were Muslims gained separate electorate. This was a positive impact of Minto-Morley reforms and Muslims enjoy it. Muslims celebrated it. It was accepted to some extent that Muslims are a separate nation in India. It was due to the Minto-Morley reforms that Muslims gained separate electorate and the system of separate electorate gave an idea, it inculcated an idea in India that yes, Muslims are a separate nation in India and they have secured their separate electorate. Then Indians gained experience of governing activities due to these reforms because it was like a kind of a small assembly because the additional members were increased to 60. The additional members, meaning the locals of India, were 60 in legislative council at the time. So Indians gained experience of governing activities. Ahmad Said states in his book Trek to Pakistan that Indians started discussing governing processes, they started debating in Governor General's Council, and it was a positive impact of these reforms. It was beneficial for not for Muslims only but for Hindus also. It was beneficial for Indians collectively. Now let's see the negative aspects of the reforms. Well, these councils were only consultative in nature. I mean, Indians used to discuss in the council, they used to debate, but it was only consultative in nature. It was just another step, another dose to pacify the agitated Indians. Government did not give any importance to the councils and it did not give any importance to the resolutions passed by the councils. It was just to pacify the Indians. I mean, authority was still in the hand of British government and it did not give any importance to what the Indians were saying. The aim of pacifying the Indians was achieved, the goal was achieved for a short period of time, but we can say that it was nonetheless a good step because it was a step in the constitutional evolution of India. So these were the impacts and the reaction of Indians for Minto-Morley reforms and we have studied it in detail. So this is enough for Minto-Morley reforms. Now let's move forward. So now we are done with the Simla Deputation and Minto-Morley reforms, the two most important topics of today's lecture. And now we're going to study the last topic of today's lecture, that is the change of All India Muslim League politics. After 1911, students, All India Muslim League completely changed its constitution. It completely changed the way it used to do politics. The aims and objectives we studied in the previous slide when we were studying the formation of All India Muslim League. What were the aims and objectives of All India Muslim League? What was the old constitution of All India Muslim League? Let's revise it again here. The aims and objectives were majorly three aims and objectives were there. First of all, it was to promote feeling of loyalty to the British government. Then, All India Muslim League was formed to protect and advance the political rights of Muslims in India. Then it was formed to prevent rise of hostilities in Muslims against any community in India. But then, after 1911, All India Muslim League changed its constitution completely. Then, it started exploring ways to get rid of British loyalism. It wanted to get rid of British authority. This was the new part of politics of All India Muslim League. But What led to this change? Why All India Muslim League changed its path of politics? Well, definitely, there took place some incidents that caused All India Muslim League change its path completely. I have enlisted down here all the incidents that made the leaders of All India Muslim League realize that now they should change their path of politics. So first of all, it was the annulment of partition of Bengal in 1911 that made All India Muslim League's leader change their mind, change their way of politics. In 1911, when British authority annulled the partition of Bengal, Muslims were disillusioned. Muslims felt betrayed because Muslims were happy with the partition of Bengal. But British Parliament surrendered in front of the protest started by Hindus and they annulled the partition of Bengal. They decided in favor of Hindus. They took the side of Hindus. And they showed complete disregard to the interest of Muslims and they annulled the partition of Bengal. This was the first incident that disillusioned Muslims and that made Muslims realize that Britishers cannot be trusted and Britishers can change their mind any time. They started fearing that Muslims may lose the right of separate electorate in future because they started mistrusting British because of this annulment of partition of Bengal in 1911. They felt betrayed. So this was the first incident that caused this change of mind of Muslim leaders. Then Britishers refused to give patronage to Aligarh Muslim University. This was also a very saddening event in the pre-partition history of Pakistan when Aligarh Muslim College was supposed to upgrade to university, but British government suddenly announced that if they give patronage to Aligarh Muslim College, then this university would not be associated to Sir Syed anymore. In fact, it would be associated to British government. This was something that blew Muslim leaders, and they did not like it. Muslim leaders who were running the college at the time felt betrayed and they did not accept this demand of British, and when they did so, when they declined this demand of British, Britishers refused from giving any patronage to Aligarh Muslim University. So this was another incident that caused change of mind of Muslim leaders. Then the wretched conditions of Muslim countries also made Muslims realize that Britishers would never ever work for the betterment of Muslims. Britishers do not have any sympathy for Muslims. Muslims were facing atrocities at the hand of English. Muslims were suppressed in Tripoli that was invaded by Italy, but Britishers were not doing anything to protect Muslims. So this was the thing that made Muslims of India realize that Britishers are of no use to Muslims. Britishers would never take the side of Muslims. So this was another incident. Then the invasion of Turkey by Balkan states in 1912 realized Muslims that they should change the way they do politics. In 1912, Balkan states invaded Turkey, which was under Ottoman Empire at the time, and Muslims of India expected that British would do anything to protect the Turkey, but they did not do anything and they were not bothered by it. So All India Muslim League's leader also felt threatened and they started feeling that now they should do something to defend the Muslims of India. So they changed their path of politics. Then persecution of Iran by Russia in 1912 was another incident that caused this change. In 1912, scholars were hanged in Iran by Russians, and Iranian cities were attacked by Russia, and European leaders were not doing anything to stop Russia and to protect Muslims. So this was another thing, another incident that disillusioned Muslims. Then a very heinous, a very gruesome tragedy took place in 1913, Kanpur Mosque tragedy. This is a little important, so I would discuss this in detail in future in next slides. So I'm not going to discuss it here. And then another fact that caused change of path of All India Muslim League was the change of leadership of All India Muslim League. After 1911, leaders were changed. Sayyid Amir Ali resigned, Mohsin al-Mulk was dead, and these leaders were not leader of All India Muslim League anymore, and it was the time of Quaid-e-Azam. Quaid-e-Azam came to the front, so there was a change of leadership of All India Muslim League. So this was also another reason behind the change of constitution of All India Muslim League, and behind the change of the way All India Muslim League used to do politics. So these were all the incidents that caused All India Muslim League change its path after 1911. Alright students, so now we're going to study Kanpur Mosque tragedy that happened in 1913. This was an incident of humiliation, degradation and injustice to Muslims. This is not very important from paper's point of view, but all CSS aspirants must have some knowledge of this incident. This is important for CSS students. I mean, they should have knowledge of what happened in Kanpur Mosque and what was this tragedy. They should have some idea. So I have added some material here from the book Track to Pakistan, and I'm going to explain it here. So first of all, I've added this quotation by Sayyid Ali Raza. Sayyid Ali Raza says that Kanpur Mosque tragedy can be regarded as one of the worst examples of the British statesmanship in India. So at the outset, I've given a quote that gives an idea that how gruesome, how heinous this tragedy was. So what happened actually in 1908, the government of UP started some welfare projects in Kanpur, and widening of some road, which is called AB Road, was also part of these welfare projects. But this widening became a serious issue. There was a Hindu temple just opposite a mosque in the Machli Bazaar. Machli Bazaar was a bazaar at AB Road of Kanpur, and this road was supposed to be widened in those welfare projects. But Hindus forced government to abandon this scheme. They did not want demolition of this temple. Then the only way left was to demolish a part of mosque that was used for bath and ablution. And when Hindus forced government to abandon this scheme, and Hindus warned government of not demolishing the Hindu temple, Muslims feared the demolition of the mosque. And then Muslims presented a memorial to Lieutenant Governor of Kanpur in 1913. James Maston, who was Lieutenant Governor at the time, he showed complete disregard for the sentiments of Muslims, and he replied that the area they're going to demolish is used for the bath and ablution in mosque, so it should not be considered a part of mosque, and it should not be considered as sacred as the mosque itself. So there is no problem in demolishing that area. So government demolished eastern part of the mosque, and it provoked anger and outrage among Muslims community of Kanpur. Then Muslims protested, but their protest was not violent. They just showed some black flags, and when they protested, they were killed under the order of Kanpur's magistrate. Police opened fire and the protesters were killed. So this was the Kanpur Mosque tragedy, when British showed their complete disregard for the sentiments of Muslims and for the lives of Muslims. They killed Muslims. They opened fire on Muslims. This tragedy was condemned by Muslim press and All India Muslim League also, for sure, but unsurprisingly, Hindu press did not sympathize with Muslims. In fact, Hindus referred to those killed, the Muslims were killed, they called them ignorant fanatics who took law in their hands. This is what Hindus expressed about the people who were killed in the tragedy. So here we can make an idea that how Hindus are trying to side with British and they're trying to isolate Muslims. They're trying to vilify Muslims in the eyes of British. Then Sir James Maston attitude also deepened the wounds of Muslims. What he did, he distributed merit certificates among those policemen who participated, who fired on Muslims. It was not only injustice but also degradation and humiliation of Muslims by British. Then this tragedy awakened political consciousness among the Indian Muslims. It disillusioned Indian Muslims. And it also stimulated hatred for British Raj. After this incident, Muslim leaders realized that British would never protect Muslims and British do not have any interest in preserving the rights of Muslims. So these all were the incidents that made Muslim leaders change their path of politics. This is why after 1911, after 1913, All India Muslim League changed its path of politics. So this is all about Kanpur Mosque tragedy of 1913. This is the end of this lecture today. Today we have studied Simla Deputation of 1906, Minto-Morley Reforms, formation of All India Muslim League, and the change of path of All India Muslim League's politics. And we have studied a little bit about Kanpur Mosque tragedy. In fact, this is enough of Kanpur Mosque tragedy. So this is the end of today's lecture. Inshallah, in next lecture, we would study Lucknow Pact and Montego-Chelmsford reforms. So till then, study hard and prepare well for examination, and Allah Hafiz.